On January 22nd, 2026, a man walked into a newspaper office in Hamburg and said something that reverberated through world football before the day was over. His name was Oak Gutlich. He is the president of FC St. Pauli, one of the most politically conscious football clubs in Europe. He is also a vice president of the German Football Association, one of the four most powerful football federations on earth, representing a nation that has won the World Cup 4 times and helped shape the modern game's governance at every level. And what he said to the Hamburger Morgenpost was not a complaint about a VAR decision or a protest about a transfer fee, or an opinion about which formation works best against a low block. He said the time had definitely come to discuss boycotting the 2026 World Cup. Not as a fringe voice, not as a protester outside a stadium, as an executive of the DFB, in writing, in a national newspaper, invoking directly and by name the 1980 Olympic boycott, asking, out loud and on the record, whether the political circumstances surrounding this tournament were more threatening than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that prompted 65 nations to stay home from Moscow. By my reckoning, he said, the potential threat is greater now than it was then. We need to have this discussion. That sentence, from that man, in that newspaper, is the moment this story began. Not the empty seats in Guadalajara, not the Attorney General subpoenas in New York and New Jersey, not the $90 ticket in 2025 that cost $900 by June of 2026. Those things were all coming. But it was Germany that said it first, loudest, and from a position of institutional authority that no other voice in football could claim. And what makes Germany's warning matter, in a way that a petition, or a social media campaign, or even a formal fan group complaint simply cannot, is what Germany is in the architecture of world football. They are not a peripheral voice. They are not a small federation raising a concern from the margins of the sport's power structure. They are one of its pillars. They have stood inside FIFA's decision-making rooms for decades. When Germany speaks about the World Cup, the football world stops and listens. Not because it has to, because it has always been right to do so. And Germany was saying this World Cup had a problem. The question that has followed this tournament, from that January afternoon in Hamburg, all the way to the opened group stage matches, the empty seats in Guadalajara, and the attorneys general circling with subpoenas, is whether anyone at FIFA was truly listening. To understand what Gutlich was responding to, you need to understand the environment inside which his remarks arrived. Because the January warning did not come from nowhere. It came at the end of a sequence of months during which the conditions around the 2026 World Cup had been changing in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention, and largely invisible in FIFA's public communications. The ticket pricing story had been building since September of 2025, when FIFA opened its first sales window with a promise that had been embedded in the original host bid documents years before. A seat at the final, the bid had said, would cost a maximum of $1,550. By the time the first sales window closed, the final's cheapest standard category was already approaching $6,000. By April of 2026, it would reach nearly $11,000. The German Football Association had obtained and published leaked pricing tables, showing what fans who wanted to follow the national team through the tournament would actually pay. The numbers were not the numbers FIFA's public communications had built the narrative around. The leaked tables showed group stage tickets between $180 and $700 through federation allocations. The $60 entry tier that FIFA's president would repeatedly cite as evidence of accessibility was, according to the DFB's own analysis, functionally unavailable to most supporters by the time general public sales opened. It had been absorbed by federation-level distributions before ordinary fans could access it. Football Supporters Europe calculated that following a team through the entire 2026 tournament would cost $6,540, compared with approximately $1,390 in Qatar. A 370% increase. In the same comparison, final tickets had gone from $572 in Qatar to nearly $4,000 through federation allocation at this tournament, and significantly more through FIFA's own direct sales. Those numbers were circulating inside European football's administrative structures months before the tournament began. The people who run national federations, who talk to supporters clubs, who process the complaints that arrive when fans discover what it actually costs to attend the event their federation qualifies for, were sitting with those numbers throughout the autumn and winter of 2025 and 2026. And Gutlich put them into words. He told the Hamburger Morgenpost that he really wondered when the time would be to think and talk about a boycott concretely. And that for him, that time had definitely come. He asked what the justifications for the Olympic boycotts of the 1980s had been, and said that by his reckoning, the potential threat was greater now. He said the tournament in Qatar had been described as too political, and asked why the 2026 tournament was being treated as completely apolitical. That, he said, really bothered him. The Daily Star, the DFB's executive committee met. The meeting was reported. The outcome was a public statement that Germany would not boycott, and that the federation remained committed to participation. But the fact that the meeting happened at all, that the federation felt compelled to convene formally to discuss the possibility, and then issue a statement confirming what had been decided, tells you more about the environment in January 2026 than any of the careful diplomatic language in the statement itself. FIFA's response to the boycott discussion was what FIFA's response always is when something uncomfortable arrives from the direction of a major federation. Acknowledgement of the concern, reaffirmation of commitment to the tournament's values, confidence in the process, and the implicit message that the train was moving and the tracks were laid, and the discussion was, at this point, largely academic. It was, in the language of institutional communication, the response of an organization that was not particularly worried. It perhaps should have been more worried, because what was happening inside Germany's football culture in January of 2026 was not isolated. It was the loudest expression of something building simultaneously across multiple European countries, in different forms, at different volumes, around the same underlying question: who is the 2026 World Cup actually for? In the Netherlands, a petition with 174,000 signatures was formally presented to Parliament, asking the national team not to attend. Not organized by fringe groups, by football supporters, presenting their names and their argument through the formal parliamentary channel available to citizens in a democracy. The Dutch Football Association's response, that the Netherlands would not boycott, qualified by the phrase "so far," two words that were carefully noticed by every football journalist in the room. So far. Not never. Not absolutely not. So far. France's sports minister said there was no desire for a boycott, and then immediately qualified that statement by not ruling out what might happen if the Greenland situation with Denmark escalated. A French government minister, at a press conference about a football tournament, discussing the geopolitical implications of Danish territorial sovereignty and what they might mean for participation in a football competition. That is the world the 2026 World Cup was being organized inside. A world where the president of the host nation was making territorial claims on the land of a NATO ally, and where football federations across Europe were being asked, by their own governments and their own supporters, to consider whether participation implied legitimacy. Spain's federation had the conversation. Belgium raised it. Denmark, whose territory was at the center of one of the year's most geopolitically charged international disputes, found itself more personally entangled in the politics of the tournament than almost any other European nation. None of them withdrew. FIFA statutes, built over decades with exactly this kind of challenge in mind, make politically motivated withdrawal from a World Cup extraordinarily costly. Fines, suspensions, potential exclusion from future competitions. The structural architecture of FIFA's governance is designed to make staying the only realistic option, regardless of how uncomfortable the alternative has become. But the conversations happened. And the conversations at this scale, across this many countries, in the weeks and months before a tournament begins, had not happened before. Not at this level. Not with serving federation executives putting their names in national newspapers next to the word boycott. And then the tournament began, and the cameras went to Guadalajara. The second match of the entire competition, South Korea versus Czech Republic. The Estadio Akron. Official attendance, 44,985, in a stadium holding nearly 46,000. And visible, sustained, undeniable rows of empty seats, captured by broadcast cameras throughout the match. FIFA's response was a photograph, a different angle, fuller looking, more people visible, sent to journalists who had asked the question in a press conference, as if the question they were asking could be answered by a camera choosing a more flattering position. It could not. FIFA defended the numbers by stating that attendance is based on scanned tickets and not visible occupancy, adding that some fans may have been in concourse areas during the match rather than in their assigned seats. Similar concerns were raised in Canada, where more than 1,000 seats reportedly remained unsold for Canada's opening match against Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ticket prices in some categories ranged between $1,645 and $2,240, further fueling debate about affordability. Fans in the concourse, for 90 minutes, of a World Cup match, in a city with a deep-rooted football culture. The explanation did not land in Germany. German football media, which had been covering the tournament's pre-kickoff controversies with a specific attention that reflected the institutional concerns Gutlick had raised in January, framed the Guadalajara images within a story that had been building for months. This was not a one-match anomaly. This was the visible consequence of a pricing and access model that multiple football people had been warning about since the tickets went on sale. The German fan experience of this tournament had been shaped, even before kickoff, by the numbers the DFB had published and the conversations Federation officials had been having with supporter groups. Traveling to the United States to follow Germany required decisions about money at a scale that previous World Cups had not demanded. Figures shared by European fan groups showed that following a team throughout the 2026 tournament could cost over $6,000, compared with about $1,300 in Qatar. A staggering 370% increase, and that is before factoring in travel, accommodation, and local expenses, all of which were significantly higher in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. German supporters did not simply absorb those numbers and book anyway. Some did. Many did not. The European flight booking data for the tournament period told the story that FIFA's official statements about unprecedented demand was not telling. Bookings from Europe to the United States for the summer were running 14% below the same period in the previous year, despite a weaker dollar that should have made the trip cheaper in currency terms, not more expensive. The fans who didn't come were not making an economic decision alone. They were making a decision about whether the entire experience, the cost, the visa uncertainty, the complexity of navigating 3 host nations across a continent where accommodation was priced at World Cup premium rates, was worth attempting for a tournament that FIFA's own communications had described as the most accessible in history. The gap between that description and the reality that the DFB's leaked pricing tables had shown, that the attorney generals of New York, New Jersey, California, and Texas had investigated, that Football Supporters Europe had taken to the European Commission, and that Gutlick had named in the Hamburger Morgenpost in January, was the gap in which the empty seats in Guadalajara existed. Consumer research explains exactly what went wrong. When people buy a service rarely and can't understand how the price was set, they don't just feel frustrated, they feel cheated. And when they feel cheated, they walk away. FIFA treated fan loyalty as guaranteed demand. The Sunday Guardian. That sentence, from an academic analysis published in The Conversation, describes what Germany's football establishment had been saying in different language for months. The supporters who should have been in those seats were not there because they felt, in the specific and unforgiving way that people feel when an institution they trust uses language that does not match its actions, that they had been lied to. Not about the football, about the access. About who the tournament was genuinely designed to accommodate. Gutlick had asked a question that nobody at FIFA had answered. Qatar was too political for everyone, he said, and now we're completely apolitical. That really bothers me. The Daily Star. He was pointing at something specific. The 2022 World Cup had been subjected to years of scrutiny over human rights, worker welfare, and the political nature of staging the sport's biggest event in an authoritarian state. European teams had taken the knee. Captains had planned to wear One Love armbands. Germany had covered their mouths in a team photo as a protest statement. The language of football's conscience had been loud and public and constantly present through the entire Qatar cycle. And then the 2026 World Cup arrived. With a host nation whose president had made territorial claims on a European ally's territory. With a fan access regime that had blocked supporters from 4 qualified nations. With a referee turned away at an airport after 11 hours of questioning. With a national team's coaching staff denied visas to enter the country where their matches were being played. With attorneys general from 4 American states investigating the ticketing practices of the organization running the event. And the language of football's conscience had gone quiet. Not completely. Gutlick had spoken. The Dutch parliament had debated. Sepp Blatter, FIFA's former president, had publicly urged fans to avoid the United States. Former FIFA reform lawyer Mark Peeth had given interviews in Swiss newspapers. But the institutional response from football's governing body had been to frame each controversy separately, respond to each question with the specific limited language of its particular regulatory domain, and redirect attention to the football. FIFA does not control host country immigration processes. FIFA works within the framework established by host nation governments. FIFA's ticketing model reflects the market reality of the North American commercial environment. FIFA is committed to including and welcoming all fans. Statement by statement, press conference by press conference, controversy by controversy, the organization responsible for this tournament maintained a position that located the cause of every problem somewhere other than FIFA's own decisions, and offered photographs when the cameras found the empty seats. But here is where Germany's warning matters beyond the specific tournament it was warning about. Because the question Gutlick was asking in January, and that the German football establishment has been asking through every month since, is not really about the 2026 World Cup. It is about the direction of a governing body that has been making increasingly concentrated decisions about what the World Cup is, who it serves, and how its value is extracted and distributed. The clean venue policy that renamed 10 host stadiums, the hydration breaks that broadcasters can run commercials during, the dynamic pricing that turned a $60 entry tier into a theoretical entry level that barely exists in practice, the host country choice that produced an environment where serving coaches couldn't get visas and federation presidents were denied entry to the FIFA Congress, the resale platform that charges 15% fees on both sides of every transaction, the hotel blocks returned because the demand the model assumed did not materialize at the prices the model required. Each of those decisions was FIFA's, not the host countries, not the markets, not the geopolitical environments. And each of them contributed to the conditions that produced the empty seats in Guadalajara, and the concerns that Gutlick put into words in Hamburg, and the investigation letters from New Jersey's Attorney General, and the 14% drop in European flight bookings. Germany has won 4 World Cups. They have hosted one of the most celebrated tournaments in the competition's history, the 2006 Summer of Germany, that redefined how a nation could use football as a statement of cultural identity. They understand from direct experience what a World Cup done well looks and feels like. And they understand from the same experience what the difference is between a tournament that belongs to the game and a tournament that the game is being used to belong to something else. The warning from January is still active, not as a threat of withdrawal. No federation withdrew. The structural realities of FIFA's governance made that impossible from the moment they signed the agreement to participate. But as a statement of something more durable than a boycott threat, as a statement that the people who run football in one of the sport's most important nations looked at the 2026 World Cup and saw an organization operating at a distance from the values it publicly claims. The tournament continues. The matches are real. The football, when it is being played, is extraordinary. Some stadiums have been full and loud and atmospheric in a way that makes every other conversation feel small. But the conversation Germany started in January has not ended. It has simply been joined by more voices from more countries in more languages, asking variations of the same question. When FIFA promises the most accessible World Cup in history, and a German federation executive publicly raises the word boycott, and 4 state attorneys general launch investigations, and the cameras find rows of empty seats on the second match of day 1, and a FIFA spokesperson sends a photograph to a press conference, what exactly does accessible mean? And who is it accessible to? Germany asked that question first. The tournament is still finding its answer. What do you think? Was Germany's warning the clearest signal yet that something fundamental is wrong with how FIFA is running the world's most important football tournament, and now that the empty seats are visible, and the attorney generals are investigating, and the prices are what they are? Do you think FIFA's response has been adequate? Leave it in the comments. These are the conversations this channel exists for.